How would you like to open the doors of time and go deep into history? Here, every story brings you together with the secrets of the past. Subscribe to Studio Microphone and let's travel through time together. You step into a village where the air itself carries whispers. There are no fancy invitations here. No gold-edged scrolls. No wax seals pressed by trembling hands. Not even a grumpy raven swooping in to drop secret messages on rooftops. In this place, news travels on the wind, carried from one tongue to another like an invisible thread, weaving the entire community together. It starts as a murmur at the well. Did you hear? Tomas is marrying Beatrix. By the next day, the baker has heard and tells the miller, who tells the midwife, who tells literally everyone she passes, whether they asked or not. By nightfall, even the sheep seem to know a wedding is coming. The priest, of course, is always the last to find out. And no one needs an official invitation. If you're alive and within walking distance, you're expected to show up. Not because you're a dear friend of the couple, but because weddings mean food, ale, laughter, and maybe even a good-natured fistfight if things get too merry. The bride and groom don't fuss with guest lists. They couldn't, even if they tried. You might get 10 guests, or half the county. More guests meant more gifts, though, at least in peasant terms. An extra chicken, a sack of turnips, treasures if you're living hand-to-mouth. Of course, you had to be ready for surprises. Some folks wouldn't show because they were drunk, busy, or dead. One poor man missed his own cousin's wedding because he was too deep in the barley harvest to notice. Here, time was a fluid thing. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no clocks, only the sun, and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. There were no seating charts, no name cards delicately scrawled in ink. You plopped down wherever you found space. A log, a rock, a haystack. If a pig had claimed your seat first, too bad. The pig stayed. Formal clothing? That was more of a hope than an expectation. Fashion here wasn't about elegance. It was about not being naked and maybe brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride wore her best dress. Was it white? Probably not. White fabric was impractical, absurdly expensive, and a magnet for every chicken and goat in the vicinity. More likely, it was brown or gray, or used to be white before 3 harvests and a sheep-related incident transformed it. If it was spring, she might weave a crown of wildflowers. In winter, she'd settle for a ribbon borrowed from an old curtain or someone's extra belt. She wasn't aiming to look like a queen, just someone who hadn't been digging onions all morning. The groom made an effort too. He might wash his tunic and comb his hair, assuming he still had any. If he owned shoes, they went on. If not, bare feet were fine, callous soles were considered rustic, not rude. And if he smelled faintly of pig, well, so did everyone else. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want anywhere near your eyes. Bathing happened when it rained, or with the changing seasons. Accessories were rare and meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch? Stylish. A hat with a feather? Daring. A full set of teeth? That was true wealth. Children tumbled in, smeared with mud, proudly showing off whatever insect or twig they discovered along the way. Old men arrived in the same wool cloak they wore every day. Old women, bundled in layers, cast judgmental glances at everyone and muttered, "When I was a bride," under their breath. But no one cared if your sleeves didn't match or your hem was frayed. This wasn't a fashion parade. It was a sacred pause in lives defined by endless labor. If you arrived with both boots and most of your teeth, you were practically nobility. And the venue? Wherever there was space and fewer than 5 pigs. The churchyard was ideal, though peasants rarely set foot inside, reserving that holy ground for nobles and fussy saints. Vows were exchanged beneath trees, beside graves, or near a chicken coop doubling as a bandstand. If it had rained recently, and it usually had, the whole event unfolded on churned-up mud, seasoned with generous helpings of manure. Guests trudged in wearing their wedding boots, which were really just their everyday boots, paired with a slightly more resigned expression. You find yourself in a place where comfort is a distant dream. There are no rows of chairs draped in ribbons, no altars built from polished oak. Here, people stand, squat, or lean against rickety fences that groan like tired oxen under their weight. If someone dragged along a bench, it was instantly claimed by the elders, peasant royalty holding court without a throne. The rest of the crowd just tried their best not to tumble into a ditch. The decorations were whatever nature provided, mostly weeds. If a soul took the time to tie a few wildflowers or hang a ribbon on a fence post, it was considered an act of extravagant beauty, worthy of legend. The rest of the ambience was filled in by animals. Dogs sniffing every corner, chickens darting underfoot, and the occasional goat wandering into the ceremony like an uninvited guest desperate to steal the spotlight. And the smells, oh, the smells were unforgettable. The tang of pigs in the next field, the sour sweetness of sheep nearby, and the ever-present aroma of cabbage stew bubbling in someone's pot. Layer that with sweat and the sharp bite of ale breath, and the effect was less romantic wedding and more medieval cologne sampler. But nobody cared. This wasn't about luxury. It was a rare break from endless toil, and for that alone, everyone showed up. Even if the wedding was held in a puddle bordered by compost, it still beat weeding barley all day. By the time the bride and groom finally stood before the priest, most guests were already sunburnt, itching, or 3 cups of ale into the celebration. That was fine, though, because the ceremony itself wasn't much of a show. It was short, awkward, and if the priest had somewhere to be, perhaps digging a grave or chasing a wayward goose, it was even shorter. For peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers or rings or tearful vows. It was about clarity. By the 12th century, the church had begun requiring a priest's blessing, but in truth, many couples considered themselves wed the moment they spoke their consent before witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the essence of it, simple, practical, and enough to change lives. Some ceremonies included a blessing, a few murmured Latin prayers. But kissing? Rare. Not from modesty, just a general lack of enthusiasm for putting your mouth on someone else's after 6 days without soap. Rings were even rarer. A bent copper trinket or an old family token might appear, but often there were no exchanges at all. Some handed over small tokens, a scrap of cloth, a knife, a coin, or simply shook hands and hoped no one changed their mind before sunset. Consent mattered. Both bride and groom had to agree aloud and in front of witnesses. If the bride stayed silent, the priest was supposed to halt things. But a stern look from a parent, or a reminder that dowries had already been traded, usually sped things along. And just like that, it was done. No music, no pedals, no speeches. Just 2 peasants in a muddy yard agreeing to a future filled with hard labor, crying children, and if they were lucky, 1 warm blanket. Yet despite its simplicity, the moment carried weight. Words bound them together. And in this world, words had power, especially when washed down with ale. When peasants said, feast, they didn't mean tables groaning under golden platters. They meant, we have more than one kind of food today, and nobody has to steal it. There were no menus, no servers. Instead, a massive communal pot had been bubbling for hours, cradling half the village's hopes and all its root vegetables. Cabbage, onions, turnips, barley, perhaps a few dried peas. If fortune smiled, maybe even a morsel of meat. Most likely chicken sacrificed with a sigh. Otherwise, flavor was in the hands of salt or fate. There were no tables or chairs. Guests perched on rocks, benches, or even the sturdiest dogs. Bowls passed from hand to hand. If you forgot to bring one, you borrowed a neighbor's or ate from your palms. Spoons were wooden, shared, or imaginary. Fingers did most of the work. But drinks were plentiful. Ale flowed freely, homebrewed, fiery, and stronger than most expected. It burned going down but made even burnt stew taste like joy. Water existed as an option, but few dared touch it. It was often a cocktail of bacteria best left alone. Ale was safer and far more festive. Bread appeared here and there, heavy as a stone, capable of stunning a pig if thrown. You can almost smell the feast before you see it. The cheese, if it graced the table at all, was either fresh and pleasantly tangy or so old and sharp it could double as a weapon. Its appearance depended entirely on whether the cow had been in a cooperative mood that week. Sweets were unheard of unless someone contributed a handful of berries or a strip of dried fruit. And even then, people eyed the berries with deep suspicion. But for this community, it was abundance. A second bowl of stew? Luxury. A third? Unimaginable wealth. Children darted between adults, clutching crusts of bread as if they were treasures. The elders sat chewing with quiet determination. Gums be damned. Dogs prowled underfoot, scavenging scraps, earning more food than usual but far less gratitude. And though there were no gleaming platters or noble roasts, this meal meant something. It was a rare pause, a chance to eat until full bellies replaced the ache of survival, a chance to celebrate life itself rather than another winter endured. When your world is ruled by seasons, plows, and the looming shadow of plague, any excuse to gather and laugh loudly feels like victory. Forget toasters and monogram towels. In a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was simple. Bring whatever you could carry, preferably alive or edible. These weren't sentimental offerings, they were survival packs. Guests arrived bearing what little they had. A couple of eggs, a chunk of hard cheese, a chicken trussed by its feet. In truly generous moments, a small sack of grain might appear. Each gift was less a token of affection and more a practical investment in the couple's shared future. Because nothing says, "Congratulations on binding yourself for life," quite like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone would show up with something less orthodox. An old hoe missing its handle, a chewed wooden spoon, or a goat with a limp and a questionable temper. Even that was better than arriving empty-handed. Coming without a gift marked you as either desperately poor or dangerously bold, and either way, people noticed. Money rarely changed hands. Coins were unicorns in this world, so rare that peasants hoarded them like dragons guarding gold. The idea of handing over cash as a wedding present would have made everyone laugh until they coughed. Goods, not coins, kept life spinning. A jug of ale or a loaf of fresh bread made you practically a prince. And yes, sometimes gifts circled back. That goose given at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and much angrier. There were even whispers of a clay jug that had made the rounds for a decade. Nobody remembered where it came from. Nobody wanted to keep it. But gifts weren't just for the couple, they sent a message. Offering something useful proved you were invested in their success. It said, "I'm here, I belong, and maybe, when it's my turn, you'll bring me a fat chicken too." And even though the presents were simple, there was warmth in them. To give anything in a world where most had nothing was an act of quiet generosity, even if it squawked all the way to the ceremony. Every village had its cast of unforgettable characters, and all of them showed up at weddings. Uninvited, unmissable. Think of it like a reality show without cameras, but with far more goats. There was the loudmouth widow, sharp as vinegar, who blessed the happy couple before adding, "Though we all remember what happened behind the bakehouse last harvest." She wasn't gossiping to stir the pot. She was the pot. Then came the village wise woman, part healer, part witch, and full-time generator of rumors. She'd bless the couple with an unidentifiable herb and murmur, "May your cows give milk unless the moon disagrees." No one asked questions. No one made eye contact. You'd spot the retired soldier still wearing a dented helmet from battles fought 30 years earlier, if they were fought at all. He'd bellow blessings at the couple before tripping over a stump and declaring, "In my day, love was war." And of course, the drunk uncle. Every village had one. Red-nosed, too affectionate, prone to shouting marriage is glorious combat, as he tried to dance with someone's grandmother. His gift? A bent spoon or a suspiciously light jug of ale. But tradition demanded his presence, and tradition was obeyed. Beyond the personalities, weddings were the perfect breeding ground for gossip. Who arrived late? Who seemed too cozy with the shepherd? Was that gift recycled from last year's wedding? Nothing escaped the watchful eyes of the village. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had a theory. If the groom looked pale, whispers spread, "He's been hexed for sure." The whispers started during the vows and didn't stop for weeks. They wove their way through bread lines, passed quietly over milk buckets, and got baked straight into the village's collective memory. For these people, gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was survival for the mind. Life was brutal, but rumors were free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, imagine that. Now add more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely no supervision whatsoever. That's a medieval peasant wedding. Children ran everywhere, not sweetly nibbling bread or sitting still, but tearing through the gathering like feral squirrels on a barley-fueled sugar rush. And nobody stopped them. Not because the adults didn't care, they did. But they were far too busy eating, drinking, and carefully avoiding eye contact with their in-laws. With no toys or structured games, children made their own fun. They raced sticks through puddles, hurled mud balls at chickens, dared each other to poke the priest's donkey. Turnips became missiles, haystacks became crash mats. Inevitably, one child always ended up half-toppled into the stew pot. Not in it, thankfully, but close enough to cause alarm. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were slung over hips or plopped on the ground like forgotten satchels. Every few minutes, a wail broke out. Someone had tripped, been bitten, or lost their last crust of bread to a passing dog. No one panicked. This was normal. The bride and groom barely flinched. Occasionally, the bride would grab a stray toddler mid-vow, hand them off to whoever was closest with a resigned, "Here, yours now," before turning back to her promises. The child, unbothered, would scamper off like a tiny, dirt-covered gremlin. Older kids often assumed the role of supervisors, ruling over the younger ones with all the compassion of small-time landlords. "No, you can't sit there. Yes, we're allowed to take your bread." It was like Lord of the Flies, but with more dirt and worse hygiene. Truthfully, weddings were one of the rare occasions when children were not just tolerated but encouraged to run wild. Let them burn off steam, the adults thought, while we do the same. If they didn't come home scratched, bruised, and covered in someone else's breadcrumbs, had they even been to a wedding? By sundown, most were passed out in hay piles, sticky and exhausted. A few wore their new scrapes like badges of honor. Music, if you could call it that, was as unpolished as the rest of the day. Organized performances? Forget it. If fortune smiled, someone showed up with a fiddle. If fortune grinned, they even knew two tunes. More likely, the musician was that one guy every village had, the one who insisted he could play something. A flute, a pipe, a battered lute with 3 strings and 1 dream. Sometimes instruments were improvised. Pot lids and sticks, 2 jugs clinked together, or just a man enthusiastically whistling through missing teeth. If no one brought an instrument at all, congratulations. You now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting out the one wedding song they all half remembered. The words were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated endlessly until someone passed out or forgot the lyrics entirely. Drums? Anything that made noise when struck. A bucket, a barrel, once even a well-fed goose in a sack. Rhythmic stomping worked too, doubling as dance steps and an excellent rat deterrent. The playlist was limited. There were love songs where someone inevitably died, drinking songs where everyone died, and historic ballads where not only did people die, but someone's sheep went missing. Skill was irrelevant. Volume mattered. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you could keep rhythm, you were a professional. Clap in time without falling over? Legendary. Children often joined the chorus with high-pitched screeches. Dogs barked along. Occasionally, a rooster tried to solo. It was chaos, and yet somehow it worked. The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, sometimes alarming, but it filled the air with something magical. For peasants accustomed only to church bells and the drip of rain through a leaky roof, this was rare and precious. Once the music began, dancing soon followed. Not elegant waltzes or courtly steps. This was stomping, flailing, and semi-coordinated hopping performed with the unrestrained energy of people who had spent 6 months bent over barley fields. There were no choreographed routines, no proper forms. What you witnessed wasn't organized dancing, it was instinct unleashed. It was raw celebration, chaotic yet brimming with sincerity. People formed circles, lines, or odd shapes somewhere in between, and they moved with wild abandon. There was clapping, stomping, shouting, and the occasional accidental slap on a neighbor's back. Rhythm? Optional. Feet pounded the ground with such force they startled nearby birds and churned mud into the air. Arms were slung over shoulders, old friends reunited in laughter, and the elderly cheered from the sidelines, clapping along and delighting in anyone who managed to stay upright for more than 3 songs. A few ambitious dancers, those who had once traveled to bigger towns or heard stories of a passing performer years ago, attempted fancy steps. A spin here, a leap there. Most landed awkwardly and pretended they'd meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were optional. By the second dance, many had kicked them off or simply lost them in the mud. Bare feet became part of the percussion section, slapping the earth in time or out of time with the music. Falls were frequent, but instead of embarrassment, each tumble earned a raucous cheer from the crowd. Falling wasn't failure, it was part of the ritual. The bride and groom, of course, weren't allowed to hide. The villagers chanted, teased, and sometimes physically pushed them into the center. They danced with flushed cheeks, laughter spilling out, silently begging for someone else to claim the spotlight. Children were everywhere, inventing moves no adult could imitate, spinning until they collapsed, forming impromptu conga lines, their giggles rising above the music. No one knew where they learned these things. They simply did. The dancing wasn't elegant, but it was honest. It was peasants declaring, "We're alive, we're full, we're together, let's move." If music was optional and dancing improvised, ale was mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it. And not just a pint or two, there were barrels, jugs, buckets, even old boots repurposed as drinking vessels. Water was suspect in these parts, often crawling with frogs, filth, or worse. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during brewing, making it safer, and infinitely more entertaining. The ale varied in strength. Some batches were gentle enough for children and the elderly. Others packed the punch of a blacksmith's hammer, capable of knocking down even the sturdiest farmer after 3 cups. The strongest stuff came from deep wooden casks, ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it. You just drank and prayed you'd remember something of the night. Mugs passed freely from hand to hand. If you had your own, fine. If not, you shared. Germs weren't a concern. Most people had never heard the word. That pleasant burn on the way down? That's the cleaning effect, they joked, or possibly the first step toward blindness. With every round, the crowd grew louder and looser. Laughter deepened into belly-aching roars. Stories grew taller with each telling. Compliments flowed freely, from the bride's radiant smile to the groom's curiously shaped knees. Someone always broke into a drinking song, which soon became a shouting contest and ended with a nap under the nearest table. And there was always one villager, there's always one, who drank far past their limit. They started the evening singing and ended it vomiting behind a haystack. No one scolded. This too was tradition. In a world of backbreaking work, endless winters, and fleeting joys, ale was more than a drink. It was the glue that bound them all. It loosened tongues, opened hearts, sparked confessions, and occasionally led to someone tumbling into a water trough. At a wedding, ale transformed a solemn union into a raucous celebration. One people might not remember clearly, but would cherish all the same. And no such wedding was complete without a little chaos. Not the kind you plan, but the sort that bubbles up naturally when elbows bump the wrong jug or a cousin flirts with the wrong person. Because weddings were more than unions, they were matchmaking festivals. After all, this was the rare moment peasants could see one another without soot on their faces or mud clinging to their tunics. It was medieval speed dating. Glances turned to smiles. Awkward flowers changed hands. Brave souls recited poetry, rhyming hay with May before losing their nerve. The dance floor became prime territory for courtship, though most moves involved tripping over someone's foot and pretending it was romantic. Not every flirtation ended with a shy smile. Some ended in a scuffle. The usual sparks? Someone danced a little too close to another's sweetheart. Someone sloshed ale on a borrowed tunic, or someone insulted a goat's dignity. Fights rarely turned serious, though. They were more like muddy wrestling matches accompanied by slurred shouting. Nobody rushed to break them up. By the time it was over, the combatants were usually too tired or too drunk to remember why they started. They'd shake hands, share a drink, and carry on as if nothing had happened. Then came the accidents. Weddings plus livestock plus copious ale meant unpredictable results. Chickens got stepped on. Children tumbled into barrels. Someone always managed to trip into the stew pot. Once, a goat tangled itself in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet before anyone noticed. She survived. The goat received applause. No one was surprised. Mishaps were part of the charm. They became the stuff of legend. Remember Tomas's wedding when old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant village folklore, where nobles dined under candlelight with pristine banquets and carefully rehearsed toasts. Peasants had spilled ale, surprise kisses, and the occasional bump on the head. Somehow that felt more honest. At every wedding, there came a moment, usually after the fourth drinking song but before the goat stole the bread, when someone would pause, glance around, and ask the inevitable, "Where'd the bride and groom disappear to?" Cue knowing smirks, raised eyebrows, and aunties elbowing each other with whispers like, "Well, they didn't waste any time." Everyone knew exactly what was happening. You see, in medieval Europe, consummation wasn't just tradition. It was legally required. A marriage wasn't truly valid until it had been made official on a creaking straw mattress. In earlier times, there were even witnesses, a curious mix of custom and nosiness. But by the later Middle Ages, most villages wisely dropped that part of the ritual. The newlyweds would slip away to a barn, a back room, or a loft. Someone had probably swept the floor in their honor. Privacy was relative, there were no locks and curtains were rare, but the symbolism mattered. Let them vanish. Let them bond. Meanwhile, the party continued without pause. Dancing, singing, and clumsy toasts carried on. If anything, their absence gave people new material for gossip. "How long do you think they'll be gone? She seemed like she knew what she was doing." "Well, his mother said he's clumsy." When the couple finally reappeared, rumpled, flushed, and wearing victorious grins, no one said a word aloud, but every glance told a story. The groom received hearty handshakes. The bride got proud nods and unsolicited advice from women who'd been married since the Great Turnip Shortage of 1314. Sometimes the couple didn't return at all. They stayed tucked away, savoring their brief escape from mud, noise, and neighbors who couldn't resist commenting. There were no honeymoons for peasant newlyweds, but that stolen hour of privacy? That was as close as they'd get. The morning after a peasant wedding was less sunrise romance and more a chorus of groans paired with the scent of stale ale and livestock. The music, laughter, and frantic goat chasing were gone. In their place, sore feet, empty barrels, and the realization that someone had definitely spent the night in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged slowly from wherever they'd collapsed. Haystacks, carts, sheds, or curled around the communal fire like oversized, snoring cats. Hair was tangled. Tunics were caked in mud. One man wore another's cloak and showed no intention of giving it back. The feast table looked like a battlefield. Half-eaten loaves, overturned mugs, a stew pot tipped on its side, and a chicken strutting across it like the new lord of the manor. Someone discovered a single shoe dangling from a tree branch. Another villager had mysteriously acquired a dog. Children were already up, wide-eyed and sticky, dragging sticks through puddles and singing garbled versions of the wedding song with lyrics they'd made up. One toddler proudly carried a goose egg. Nobody knew where he found it or if the goose approved. As for the bride and groom, still hiding most likely, they'd reappear eventually, tousled and weary, bits of straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, livestock wrangling, and the quiet, daily grind of survival. But on that morning, they were allowed to remain mythical. A king and queen of the hayloft, celebrated and left in peace. Those with stronger stomachs stayed behind to clean. Bread crusts were gathered, mugs stacked, barrels rolled back to their places. Others sat slumped on logs, cradling aching heads and muttering quiet prayers for silence, strong tea, or perhaps the invention of time travel. The priest strolled past with an irritatingly smug expression. He hadn't joined in the revelry. He remembered everything, and worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet despite the mess, no one complained. A calm satisfaction hung in the air. The wedding had happened. The couple was wed. The village had gathered, danced, eaten, spilled ale, bled a little and survived. That was enough. When you imagine a medieval wedding, it's easy to picture elegance. Flower garlands swaying in the breeze, flowing gowns, sweet music drifting through the trees. And perhaps somewhere in a noble's hall it really did look like that. But for peasants, the truth was simpler and far more alive. Mud, laughter, scraped knees, boiled cabbage, and a deep sense of community. These weddings weren't about grandeur. They weren't performances designed to impress. There were no photographers, no coordinators, no carefully curated mood boards. What existed and what truly mattered was presence. The whole village came together, not just to witness two people exchange vows, but to take part in something rare, joy. For peasants, life wasn't merely hard. It was relentless. Hunger, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble charging through your barley field left little room for celebration. Fun was rare and often viewed with suspicion. Weddings, however, were the exception, a sacred pause in the grind of survival. For one precious day, dirt-streaked hands held bread instead of tools. Voices that usually cursed rocks and weeds now lifted in song. And even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone took a donkey's hoof to the shin, none of it mattered. What mattered was this: the village gathering to say, "These two now face the world together. Let's spill, sing, and shout in their honor." The legacy of these weddings wasn't captured in stained glass windows or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lingered in stories retold by bread fires, in songs hummed during the next harvest, in quiet smiles shared by a couple months later as they stirred a pot of cabbage with calloused hands. It lived in the muddy footprints, the goose-related injuries, and the gossip that grew into legend over time. It was real, it was messy, and most importantly, it belonged to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it sometimes felt like it might in the Middle Ages, they would still have this memory. A day when life felt lighter, when no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. But now, let us drift to another world, far from muddy fields and restless goats. In ancient Greece, before the first cup of wine was poured, before any lyre was plucked, there were rules, many of them. For all its reputation as a celebration, the Greek symposium wasn't a mindless drinking spree. It was ritualized, exclusive, and strangely sacred. You couldn't simply show up and demand a seat. Invitations came carefully curated by the host, the symposiarch, who controlled the night's tone. This was an all-male affair, freeborn men only. Slaves served, while wives stayed home. The only women present were hetaira, courtesans trained in music, conversation, and wit. The evening began with the deepnon, a leisurely meal where guests reclined on couches, propped on cushions like philosophers in repose. But this was just the warm-up. No wine yet. That would come after the tables were cleared and the floors swept. Then the real event began. Wine was mixed with water in a massive crater. Drinking it pure, as the Scythians did, was considered barbaric. The symposiarch decided the strength of the mix: mild for thoughtful conversation, potent for those who sought the sweet chaos of Dionysus. It was a fine line. Too weak, and the evening felt dull. Too strong, and Plato's dialogues dissolved into a Dionysian disaster. Yet every symposium had a purpose: philosophical, poetic, or political. Beneath the laughter and riddles lay a sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called skol. It wasn't wasted time. This was where ideas blossomed, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, composed impromptu verse, and, occasionally, fell in love. Before debates began, libations were poured to Dionysus, god of wine and divine madness. Flute girls played soft tunes. Courtesans challenged guests to riddles. The wine flowed clockwise around the room, each round paired with a toast. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. Getting sloppy, a disgrace. The perfect guest was witty, graceful, and just tipsy enough to speak the truth beautifully. In the end, the symposium was as much a performance as it was a party. It was a stage where men tested not only their tolerance for wine but their skill in wit and philosophy. It was a delicate dance between reason and indulgence, where one false step didn't just embarrass you, it offended the very spirit of the gathering. The physical space was no accident. Every detail was designed for minds and bodies to interact in perfect rhythm. The event unfolded in the andron, a room in Greek households reserved solely for men. It was square and lined with couches, each wide enough for a man to recline on one elbow while reaching for his cup with the other. The center of the room was left open, providing space for servants to pour wine, dancers to weave among the guests, or impromptu games of tossing wine leaves at a target. Yes, even ancient Greeks had their drinking games. Soft light flickered from oil lamps, their glow mingling with the scent of burning incense, roasted meats, and perfumes worn by courtesans. The atmosphere was intimate, designed to soften inhibitions without extinguishing thought. Couches circled the room, drawing every guest into shared eye contact, verbal sparring, and laughter that echoed off painted walls. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychology. There was no head of the table. No one sat higher than the others. This physical equality created a fleeting sense of democracy, an egalitarian moment in a world where hierarchy ruled. Yet no two symposia were alike. Some were quiet strategy sessions in disguise, where political plots took shape between sips of watered wine. Others dissolved into raucous singing contests and uninhibited dancing. A few, like the famous gathering described in Plato's Symposium, hovered in a space that felt almost religious, an ascent from desire to divine truth. But they all began the same way, with a shared space, a shared cup, and a shared sense that something meaningful, perhaps even transformative, was about to unfold. Even the decorations whispered messages. The walls often bore images of myth: Hercules feasting among the gods, Dionysus leading his wild, drunken entourage, satyrs chasing nymphs in playful abandon. These were more than pretty pictures. They were reminders of the thin boundary between civilization and ecstatic chaos, murmuring, "This is play, but it is sacred play." And then there was the wine. It wasn't served in plain vessels, but in kylakes, wide cups painted with erotic or comic scenes that revealed themselves only as the drinker emptied his cup. That final moment, when the bottom image came into view, sparked laughter, blushes, and clever remarks, depending on who was watching. At the heart of many symposia was a dynamic that still fascinates and unsettles modern minds: the paiderastia relationship. Here, an older man, the Erastes, acted as mentor and admirer to a younger male beloved, the Ereminos. This wasn't merely accepted, it was idealized. The elder was expected to guide, teach, and refine. The youth, often an aristocratic teen, was both student and inspiration. In theory, these bonds were about virtue, discipline, and the passing of wisdom. In practice, they often thrummed with an undercurrent of erotic tension. Poetry, wordplay, and compliments became the older man's tools of persuasion. Restraint was prized. To grab or grope was vulgar. True dignity lay in subtlety and self-control. The beloved youth, meanwhile, was expected to deflect advances with grace and wit. A boy who yielded too easily lost status. One who refused all affection risked being called cold. The ideal balance somewhere in between. Blushing, teasing, listening, absorbing both affection and philosophical insight. Not every guest played this game, of course. Married men were supposed to behave, though many didn't. Courtesans and hetaira were free to offer physical pleasures. But the boys? They represented something higher. They were muses for the elite, embodiments of fleeting beauty and reminders that time was cruel. Their presence nudged older men to reflect on mortality, passion, and why philosophy mattered in the first place. Plato famously used the symposium to explore the nature of love itself, a ladder climbing from physical attraction to divine contemplation. But that lofty ascent began in the flickering glow of a room, with wine in hand, and the intimacy of a couch shared between teacher and student. In these moments, wine was not merely a drink. It was the fuel, the compass, and the test. The Greeks didn't drink the way we do today. To them, sipping wine unmixed with water wasn't just strange. It was barbaric. A true Greek gentleman always diluted his wine, often with 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Why? Because the purpose of drinking wasn't to overwhelm the senses. It was to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind. At the heart of every symposium stood the crater, a massive mixing vessel like an altar, radiating the scent of fermented grapes and flickering lamplight. The symposiarch, elected to oversee the evening, held great power. He decided the ratio of water to wine. A stronger blend signaled a night of wild laughter and impulsive dancing. A weaker mix hinted at an evening devoted to poetry and deep conversation. It was a delicate balance. Drink too little and the gathering dragged. Drink too much and you risked vomiting on your neighbor's sandals. An act that guaranteed eternal shame and years of ridicule in retellings. Each man cradled a beautifully painted cup as the wine was ladled out in clockwise rounds. But drinking was never about mindless consumption. It had rhythm, almost like ritual. Every round came with a toast, a song, or a clever remark. Wine was meant to invite vulnerability and creativity, and, occasionally, divine madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could spark both brilliant insight and total chaos depending on how much you poured. A respectable man knew how to navigate this delicate path. To sip, to joke, to recite Homer, and still sit upright, that was the mark of balance. Losing control? That was for barbarians. In truth, the symposium doubled as a training ground, a place where pleasure met discipline. To enjoy wine and still govern oneself was considered the height of masculine virtue. That didn't stop disasters. Somewhere in every gathering, there was always the man who drank too deeply, danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, and mistook a serving boy for a satyr. Stories of such mishaps became cautionary tales, passed around for years. But on the other side of the spectrum, a slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke with beauty and conviction on justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment was lofty contemplation. When the wine flowed freely and minds relaxed, the Greeks turned to games and music, structured amusements designed to reveal a man's spirit, cleverness, and social charm. The symposium was as much a stage for performance as it was a space for thought. One favorite pastime was katabos, a surprisingly elegant game where men flicked the dregs of their wine at a target. A saucer balanced on a stand or floating in water, trying to topple it with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill. Carried symbolism, too. Players often called out the name of a lover as they launched their wine. Strike true and the gods approved your passion. Miss and perhaps you weren't worthy. Music wove its way through the night. A hired flute girl played haunting melodies to accompany a toast or wandered between couches with her instrument. Sometimes, she danced herself, swirling in time with the rising energy of the room. Yet the guests weren't merely spectators. They were expected to perform, reciting Homer, improvising risque poetry, or singing bawdy drinking songs. A man who couldn't carry a tune or deliver a clever verse faced silent judgment, or worse, a sharp rebuke from his peers. But the true performance was in words. Conversation was an art form here. Witty banter, philosophical riddles, and playful verbal duels tested memory, charm, and intellect all at once. The finest guests could weave a dirty pun and a profound theory on justice in the same breath, leaving the room roaring with laughter or stunned into silence. A well-timed riddle might ignite debate or dissolve everyone into tears of mirth. And when everything aligned, the wine perfectly balanced, the company sharp, the games and songs flowing freely, the night felt almost magical. Half performance, half revelation. The goal wasn't merely to impress. It was to connect, to let personality, intellect, and desire entwine in playful chaos. Reputations were made here or unmade. While Greek wives stayed behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual freedom of the symposium, another kind of woman moved through the lamplight like a muse. The Hetaira. These high-class courtesans weren't mere entertainers. They were educated, witty, and skilled in music, conversation, and seduction. A Hetaira could recite poetry, challenge a nobleman in philosophical debate, sing alongside the lyre, and outflirt even the cleverest aristocrat. She wasn't simply present at the symposium, she was essential to it, holding her own in a world of sharp minds and sharper tongues. Unlike most Greek women, the Hetaira were not confined to quiet lives behind household walls. These women could own property, attend lavish parties, and even amass personal wealth. A few became legends in their own time, like Aspasia, the renowned companion of Pericles, whispered to have taught rhetoric to some of Athens' sharpest minds. But make no mistake, their status was complicated. They walked a narrow path between admiration and mockery, celebrated for their intellect and charm yet often reduced to objects of satire and desire. Still, in the wine-soaked chambers of the symposium, the Hetaira stood apart. She was often the only woman allowed to speak freely, and to be heard. Her presence changed everything. With her, the gathering shifted from a boys' club of philosophy and flirtation into a charged, unpredictable dance of power and performance. A single sharp remark from a Hetaira could puncture a man's ego or ignite a debate that lasted until dawn. They were conversational warriors, masters of teasing, challenging, and, when it suited them, humiliation. Yes, the air often hummed with erotic tension. But consummation wasn't the point. The game was the dance, the flirtation, the tension, the allure of what might happen but often didn't. Some Hetaira became lovers. Others kept their distance, wielding their beauty and wit as tools for social climbing or political intrigue. For many men, these women embodied a fantasy. Female companionship without household duty, sensuality without obedience, and intellect without restraint. They were free in ways Greek wives could never be. That freedom made them intoxicating and dangerous. In rooms designed for male pleasure, the Hetaira reminded everyone that true control was an illusion. They could topple a man's argument with a well-timed quip, steer a conversation, or inspire a poem that would echo through history. In a culture obsessed with dominance and performance, they were masters of both. While the symposium had its share of games, flirtations, and poetic excess, its deepest legacy was intellectual. Beneath the laughter and rising intoxication, something extraordinary often took root. These weren't mere drinking parties. They were laboratories of thought. Between the third cup of wine and the final riddle, guests launched into debates that would shape Western philosophy. The most famous example lives in Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized retelling of a real evening where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others unraveled the nature of love itself. But that wasn't an isolated spark. Across Athens, symposia became crucibles where ideas clashed and merged. Politics, metaphysics, morality, and desire all were poured into the mix. These weren't dry academic lectures. They were heated battles of wit, logic, and conviction. The setting mattered. Wine softened defenses, humor cushioned blows, and the intimate circle of couches gave permission for vulnerability. You could challenge a man's beliefs about justice, the gods, or even his deepest desires, and, if your words were sharp enough, win his respect. One recurring theme was eros, love, not merely as carnal attraction, but as a philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, described it as a ladder, beginning with physical desire, rising through appreciation of beauty, and ultimately reaching the contemplation of the eternal, divine form of beauty itself. That metaphor was born in the flickering lamplight of a symposium. Other questions surfaced too. What is virtue? What makes a man wise? Can the soul live on beyond death? Is pleasure a noble pursuit or a dangerous distraction? These were not idle musings. They were urgent, personal reflections, shaped between sips of spiced wine. It's no coincidence that so many great thinkers, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, frequented symposia. These gatherings offered a rare blend of leisure, intellect, sensuality, and challenge. Unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for nuance. Here, you could speak freely, revise your opinion mid-sentence, or offer an idea half-formed and watch it grow in the minds of your peers. For all their brilliance, symposia could, and often did, teeter on the edge of chaos. The tightrope between order and indulgence didn't always hold. And when it broke spectacularly. Take Alcibiades, the handsome, brilliant, and scandalous Athenian statesman. He famously burst into Plato's symposium, already drunk and crowned in ivy like Dionysus himself. Instead of offering a measured reflection on love, he delivered a wild, deeply personal, and sexually charged ode to Socrates, turning the evening upside down. It began as a noble gathering, but the symposium could just as easily spiral into chaos. One moment you had measured debate, the next unfiltered confessions tumbling out with each cup of wine. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and what was meant to be an evening of disciplined pleasure could dissolve into reckless outpourings of drunken obsession. Take Alcibiades, the brilliant, scandalous Athenian who once crashed Plato's symposium. Crowned in ivy like Dionysus himself, he stumbled in already intoxicated, turning what was meant to be a lofty discussion on love into a raw and deeply personal speech about Socrates. It was shocking, inappropriate, and strangely prophetic. Alcibiades' life mirrored the dangerous side of symposium culture. Charm without restraint, brilliance unmoored from ethics. He would betray Athens, defect to Sparta, switch allegiances again, and die in exile. And he wasn't the only one. Many political scandals began with whispered symposium gossip, who had flirted too boldly, who drank too much, who insulted a guest or blasphemed a god in a haze of wine. In Athens, a single misstep in the privacy of a symposium could unravel a public career. As time passed, the balance of intellect and indulgence shifted. In Athens' later years and during Rome's rise, the symposium's sacred play often tipped toward pure hedonism. Wine was no longer carefully diluted. Guests competed in gluttony rather than poetry. Philosophers were replaced by flute girls. What had been a crucible for thought became a spectacle of excess. Even the Spartans mocked the Athenians for their decadent symposia. To those austere warriors, reclining on couches debating love over watered wine seemed soft, effeminate, even, and a sure sign of moral decay. In some ways, they weren't wrong. The Greeks themselves understood the danger. That's why moderation was so highly prized. The ideal man was one who could drink, laugh, and charm without surrendering to chaos. Because long after the final crater was drained and the last lyre note faded, the symposium left behind more than hangovers. It left a legacy. What began as structured leisure became an unlikely engine of philosophy, art, and culture. At its heart lay a radical idea: that leisure wasn't idleness. It was sacred. The Greek word skol, leisure, gives us our word school. That's no accident. The symposium proved wisdom could flourish not just in temples or classrooms, but in wine-fueled laughter, flirtation, and fire-lit debates. Plato's symposium remains the most famous relic of that world. Its pages shaped how we speak of love, beauty, and truth. Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, the notion that desire could lead the soul toward the eternal, all were born in those intimate circles. This format, men reclining, drinking, and riffing on shared themes, became the blueprint for everything from university seminars to late-night salons. The Romans borrowed the structure for their convivium, though theirs leaned more toward feasting than philosophy. Later, Renaissance thinkers revived the spirit of the symposium in their salons and intellectual circles. Even now, its echoes remain. A dinner party where conversation turns deep at midnight. A book club that drifts into existential questions. A podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. These are the modern descendants of the symposium. Its flaws endure too. Its exclusion of women, its hierarchies of age and beauty, the ever-present danger of excess. All reminders of how communities can be built or broken. But its greatest gift may have been the union of pleasure and thought. The idea that beauty, humor, desire, and intellect can coexist in one space. That truth isn't always lectured. Sometimes, it's seduced. The symposium taught the Western world that the mind, body, and spirit each need a place to play. And in that sacred, wine-slicked space, civilization learned how to speak. Now imagine walking through the streets of ancient Thebes or Memphis. The midday sun beats down on limestone walls, and the air smells faintly of incense, lotus blossoms, and palm wine. But what draws your eye isn't the towering obelisks or gleaming temples. It's the people, men and women alike, their eyes framed with thick black kohl that extends dramatically from their lids. Their heads crowned not with their own hair, but with ornate wigs, braided, curled, and sometimes perfumed. The effect is striking, unmistakable, and utterly pervasive. In ancient Egypt, personal appearance was never just vanity. It was a language of its own. Wigs and eyeliner weren't mere trends. They were statements of identity, belief, and social standing. In ancient Egypt, appearance was far more than skin deep. It was a language, a shield, and in many ways a prayer. The dramatic eyeliner, bold, sweeping lines drawn from the corners of the eyes, was crafted from a dark green pigment called malachite or from galena, a black mineral rich in lead sulfide. Every stroke was deliberate. The look was striking, yes, but it wasn't just for beauty. Egyptians believed it protected the eyes from the searing sun, much like how athletes today smear black grease beneath their eyes. But this pigment carried deeper meaning. To them, it was spiritual armor, keeping evil spirits at bay and guarding against infections spread by the Nile's ever-present flies and bacteria. This wasn't mere superstition. Modern science now confirms what they intuited. Lead-based kohl could indeed have antimicrobial properties. In other words, their iconic eyeliner didn't just decorate, it could save lives. And then there were the wigs. These were more than ornaments. They were crowns of identity, wealth, and ritual. Shaving one's head was common practice, a practical response to Egypt's scorching climate and an effective defense against lice. But walking bare-scalped lacked elegance. Wigs solved that, offering comfort, beauty, and status all at once. For the elite, wigs were made from human hair and sometimes enhanced with plant fibers or sheep's wool for volume. Commoners might use simpler versions crafted from palm fibers or coarse materials. The designs varied wildly, from modest plates to towering structures adorned with beads, gold, and perfumed oils. A finely crafted wig was a luxury, as coveted then as a designer handbag might be today. To appear in public without your wig and kohl? For nobles, it was unthinkable. This wasn't vanity. It was a declaration. I am clean, civilized, protected, and in harmony with the gods. For the Egyptians, the eyes held sacred power. The act of painting them with kohl, called mestamet, was almost ritualistic. It invoked the protection of Horus, whose mythic eye symbolized healing and wholeness. To outline your eyes in black was to summon a shield against misfortune, both physical and spiritual. The formula for kohl was simple yet profound. Galena ground into fine powder and mixed with oils or animal fat, applied with a stick along the lash line. But its purpose went beyond mere aesthetics. It was a boundary between the soul and the chaotic world. Rich and poor alike engaged in this daily ritual. The wealthy owned delicate applicators carved from ivory or polished wood. Laborers might use rougher tools and crushed charcoal. Yet even among those toiling in the fields, lined eyes reflected a kind of everyday sacredness. And it wasn't just hygienic or mystical. The act itself carried an intimate charge. To prepare your eyes for the day was to prepare your spirit, to ready your whole being to face sun, sand, and gods alike. Wigs told their own story. In ancient Egypt, they weren't mere accessories. They spoke volumes about who you were, your social standing, your wealth, even how closely you were aligned with the divine. To the Egyptians, hair, real or false, was deeply symbolic. For the elite, wigs were art forms, elaborate constructions woven with human hair, embellished with beads, gold ornaments, and perfumed cones of scented wax that slowly melted in the heat, releasing fragrance. These wigs transformed the wearer into a vision of control and composure, a living embodiment of order in a world often ruled by chaos. Even the simplest wig carried meaning. It spoke of cleanliness, refinement, and a shared belief in the harmony between appearance and the divine order. To go without it was not just inelegant, it was uncivilized. These wigs weren't mere accessories. They were art forms sculpted into statements. Some featured elaborate curls, others tight braids or layered plaits, all held in place with beeswax and topped with fragrant cones of scented fat that slowly melted under the desert sun. As the day wore on, the cones released perfume that mingled with the heat, wrapping the wearer in an invisible halo of aroma. It was nothing short of luxurious. Even the shape of a wig spoke volumes. A short, geometric bob might signal a formal gathering, while long, cascading locks adorned with golden beads and ribbons whispered of royal authority. High-ranking priests had their own signature styles tied to sacred duties, and children, royal or common, were often depicted with the famous side lock of youth, a shaved head with a single ornate braid that signaled innocence and renewal. But wigs were far more than aesthetic armor. To cover one's head was to declare control, cleanliness, and harmony with the divine. Priests shaved their heads completely before entering temples, but donned wigs for public rituals, a subtle reminder of the boundary between sacred purity and worldly life. Over time, these wigs became cherished heirlooms, passed down through generations or buried with their owners to ensure they entered the afterlife in dignity. Some mummies have even been found with wigs still perfectly intact, delicate braids and tight curls resting atop silent faces, as if waiting for eternity to begin. If wigs were crowns, then perfume cones were the halos. Those curious lumps seen in Egyptian art perched atop elaborately braided wigs weren't mere flourishes. They were carefully crafted cones of animal fat or beeswax infused with myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and cinnamon. As the heat melted them, they bathed the wearer in divine fragrance. This wasn't about indulgence. It was a declaration. I am clean. I am sacred. I smell like the gods. Scent in ancient Egypt wasn't a luxury. It was a moral good. Cleanliness was intertwined with piety. Temples burned incense daily to invite the gods, and to walk through the city trailing lotus or frankincense was to embody harmony with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic balance and order. Perfume cones weren't reserved for banquets and ceremonies. While elite Egyptians flaunted them at celebrations, the daily ritual of washing and anointing one's body with oils was common even among laborers. After hours under the sun, they too would cleanse, oil their skin, and carry the faint scent of sacredness. Even wigs were perfumed. Some were stored with fragrant leaves woven into their strands, others refreshed with scented oils rubbed carefully into the fibers. A wealthy Egyptian's hair didn't just look beautiful, it smelled divine, and in that scent was power, status, sanctity, and undeniable allure. This attention to fragrance served practical purposes too. The melting cones moisturized the scalp and strands, shielding them from Egypt's arid winds, and may even have repelled insects. Once again, beauty and function moved hand in hand. Perhaps the most striking feature of Egyptian beauty culture was how it blurred the lines we draw today. In a world where modern ideals often assign cosmetics and grooming to women alone, ancient Egypt offered a different vision. Men lined their eyes in bold kohl. Women shaved their heads for hygiene and style. Everyone, regardless of class or gender, oiled their skin, perfumed their bodies, and wore wigs for special occasions. Beauty was not gendered. It was sacred. It was hygiene. It was social harmony. A high-status Egyptian man might begin his day with a full body cleanse, anointing himself with oils before painting his eyelids with smooth strokes of kohl. That thick black eyeliner, extending in elegant lines from corner to corner, wasn't vanity. It was identity. It was protection. Women followed similar rituals, though there's often included more intricate attention to wigs, jewelry, and fragrance. Pale skin, lush wigs adorned with beads and gold, painted lips with ochre or carmine, and wide, dramatic eyes. These were the hallmarks of elite beauty. But here's the remarkable part. These routines weren't about competing with other women or attracting male approval. They were about aligning oneself with the divine order. In Egyptian art, even the gods are shown adorned, radiant, beautified, and androgynous in their perfection. Hathor, goddess of beauty and fertility, embodied both maternal warmth and erotic power. The gods blurred gender roles constantly, reminding mortals that true beauty was a reflection of cosmic balance, not societal expectations. Osiris, the lord of the underworld, was no warrior king. In art, his skin shimmered green like new reeds, his chin bore a false beard, and his eyes were rimmed with kohl. Pharaohs like Akhenaten, too, were depicted with soft, almost genderless features, rounded bellies, almond-shaped eyes and wide hips. In this world, beautification transcended gender. It wasn't indulgence. It was expectation. A man who didn't line his eyes or perfume his body risked being seen as lazy, uncivilized, or even impious. Grooming wasn't optional. It was a duty. Even servants and laborers took part in these rituals, though with humbler materials. Where nobles powdered their lids with finely ground galena, the poor used soot. Where elites anointed their skin with frankincense and lotus oil, commoners reached for castor oil or simple plant balms. Wigs of human hair for the wealthy, linen or palm fiber for the rest. But the impulse was the same: to step into the world whole, clean, and worthy of respect. To be clean was to be close to the gods. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant. It was unholy. Hygiene became a spiritual discipline. Wigs, eyeliner, perfumes. These weren't shallow ornaments. They were proof of one's class, discipline, and readiness to move through society with dignity. It began with the body. Shaving the head and body was common for both men and women. Hair trapped sweat and lice, enemies in the desert heat. A smooth scalp signified control, purity, and spiritual alignment. Priests serving in temples were required to shave completely and bathe multiple times a day. Their sacred work demanded not just inner piety, but a visible outer cleanliness. Wigs, then, became both a practical and symbolic solution, allowing style while preserving ritual purity beneath. Bathing itself was a daily ritual for those who could afford the time and water. Wealthier households employed footed basins and servants who poured water scented with lotus or rose petals over their bodies. Natron, a naturally occurring salt, served as soap. Afterward, oils were applied generously to keep the skin supple against the desert winds. Even fragrance spoke of status. A modest castor oil might suffice for a laborer, but cinnamon, frankincense, or lotus oils marked someone of refinement. To be perfumed was to be respectable. To walk unwashed or emit an unpleasant odor, that was more than a personal failing, it was a public scandal. Eyeliner, too, carried meaning beyond aesthetics. The quality of one's kohl, how finely it was ground, which minerals it contained, and how skillfully it was applied, was another marker of class. A nobleman's kohl case might be carved from ivory or alabaster, while a worker's was fashioned from clay or wood. Clothing reinforced these signals. Light linen robes, clean and white, symbolized purity. Stains or frayed fabric hinted at laziness or low status. But beauty in Egypt wasn't just for the living. It followed the soul into eternity. The same kohl, wigs, and perfumes that declared cleanliness and devotion in life were carefully placed in tombs for the journey to the next world. To the Egyptians, death was not an end but a transition. One entered the afterlife as a perfected version of oneself. Elite mummies were buried with cosmetic jars, wig boxes, mirrors, scented oils, even combs and razors. Coffins were painted with vivid faces, eyes lined in black, wigs adorned with beads and gold. The message was clear. The soul should meet the gods clean, composed, and divine. Priests who prepared the dead performed sacred rites that included cosmetic application. They painted the eyes, anointed the skin, and sometimes placed a wig before wrapping the body in linen. This served two purposes: to preserve the flesh and to elevate the spirit. One of the most vital rituals, the opening of the mouth ceremony, symbolically restored the senses, sight, speech, smell, to the departed. Those beautifully lined eyes weren't mere decoration. They were meant to see again in paradise. The perfume cones and sacred oils ensured the soul would inhale the sweet air of eternity. Even the gods of death were portrayed as beautiful. Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of embalming, appears in art with sleek features and bold, black-lined eyes, a reminder that beauty and divinity were forever intertwined. Isis and Nephthys, the guardians of the dead, were always shown immaculate, perfect hair, divine cosmetics, their beauty untouched by time. They weren't just ideals for the living but also models for the dead. To an Egyptian, arriving in the afterlife unkempt was unthinkable. To decay, to stink, To present yourself in disarray wasn't merely a physical failure, it was a spiritual one. Beneath the elegance of Egyptian beauty rituals lay a world of tools and practices. Ritualized, sophisticated, and imbued with meaning. If you were an elite preparing for a banquet, temple service, or even your own burial, you didn't simply smear kohl with a fingertip or rake a comb through your wig without thought. You had a personal beauty kit, often as finely crafted and symbolically charged as any sacred relic. Mirrors came first, crafted from polished copper or bronze. These gleaming discs reflected the face with surprising clarity. Their handles were works of art, carved from wood, ivory, or faience into shapes of gods, lotus flowers, or protective deities. To gaze into one was not mere vanity. It was a moment of alignment with divine symmetry and cosmic order. Kohl applicators were essential. These weren't flimsy brushes, but slender rods of bone, ivory, or bronze, designed to dip into tiny stone or ceramic pots filled with powdered galena or malachite. Applying eyeliner was an act of precision, almost meditative. Some of these applicators were so treasured that they were buried with their owners, symbols of identity and care reaching beyond death. Wig combs, flat and wide, were carved to glide gently through intricate braids and curls, preserving the artistry of elaborate hairstyles. Wealthier households often kept entire grooming sets: razors for shaving, tweezers for plucking stray hairs, and scent jars filled with fragrant balms. High-ranking women sometimes had attendants devoted solely to maintaining wigs and blending personalized perfumes. Cosmetic palettes, too, were everywhere. Smooth stone slabs used to grind pigments and mix them with oils. They were present in nearly every home. Even in children's tombs, small palettes have been found, proof that beauty rituals began early and were woven into the very fabric of life. The famous Narmer palette, one of Egypt's earliest artifacts, shows cosmetic tools already bound up with politics, ritual, and aesthetics. These items weren't hidden away in drawers. They were displayed proudly, decorated with animal motifs or protective spells. To use them was not simply to beautify, it was to engage in sacred art, to embody centuries of tradition with each careful gesture. Thousands of years have passed since the last pharaoh painted his eyes or a noblewoman placed a fragrant cone atop her wig. Yet the visual language of Egyptian beauty ripples through time, its echoes visible everywhere, from high-fashion runways to modern makeup tutorials. Start with the eyes. That unmistakable cat-eye flick, the bold line extending beyond the corner, was perfected in Egypt long before Cleopatra's reign. Though she didn't invent the look, her image, immortalized in art and cinema, transformed Egyptian eyeliner into a global symbol of mystery, allure, and power. Even today, eyeliner trends chase that same dramatic shape, born in the temples of Hathor and carried through the tombs of queens. Wigs, too, have journeyed across centuries. For ancient Egyptians, they symbolized hygiene, status, and self-control. Today, they speak of transformation, identity, and empowerment. Worn proudly by celebrities, cancer survivors, and performers alike. In many ways, the modern wig carries the same message. I choose how I present myself to the world. And then there's skincare. Egyptians were early masters of exfoliation, moisturizing, and perfuming. Oils, salts, and clays weren't just practical. They expressed spirituality and discipline. The multi-step skincare rituals of today can trace their DNA directly to the anointing jars of Thebes. Even in popular culture, ancient Egyptian beauty refuses to fade. Films, music videos, and fashion campaigns draw endlessly from the visual power of Nefertiti's sculpted cheekbones or Tutankhamun's gilded mask. Their aesthetic still whispers through time, reminding us that beauty, once sacred, once survival, remains one of humanity's most enduring languages. These weren't just queens and gods. They were icons, living symbols whose beauty standards, once rooted in sacred belief, have endured for millennia as shorthand for elegance, mystery, and power. But for the Egyptians, beauty was never just about looking good. It was about health. It was about holiness. It was about identity and social order, painted in black coal and sculpted in fragrant wigs. In a world that still struggles with image, self-expression, and ritual, their message remains timeless. Beauty is power. Beauty is protection. Beauty is purpose. From the shadowed temples of Karnak to the vanity tables of today, that truth still lingers, traced in the dark lines we draw around our own eyes. And then the scene shifts. The year is 1606. Along England's foggy shores, three small ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, slip away from the harbor under the flag of the Virginia Company. This wasn't a voyage of charity or a crown-sponsored crusade for glory. It was a business venture. Investors dreamed of gold, silk, and spices, of profits vast enough to transform their lives. What they found instead was mud, disease, starvation, and the fragile seed of what would one day grow into British America. The men aboard were an odd mix. There were hardened sailors and sturdy laborers, but also gentlemen, men with fine swords and noble titles but no knowledge of farming or survival. Few had ever swung an axe or planted a seed. Their expectations, steeped in tales of adventure and easy riches, were wildly out of step with the harsh reality that waited across the Atlantic. The journey was long and brutal, more than 4 months at sea, with a brief stop in the Canary Islands and a storm-battered detour through the Caribbean. Finally, they reached the coast of what would later be called Virginia. On May 14, 1607, the settlers chose a swampy, uninhabited peninsula along the James River for their new colony. They called it Jamestown in honor of King James I. From a defensive perspective, the site seemed ideal, far enough inland to avoid Spanish patrols, and surrounded by water on 3 sides to ward off potential attacks. But it came at a terrible cost. The water was brackish and undrinkable. Mosquitoes thrived in the marshes. The soil was poor and sandy. In almost every practical sense, Jamestown was a death trap. Still, they unloaded their supplies and began building a wooden fort. Within weeks, sickness began to spread. The settlers drank from the polluted river and grew ill. Food ran low. Leadership faltered. Arguments erupted. And yet, in that mosquito-infested patch of land, they laid the first stones of what would eventually become an empire. The gamble was immense. The risk was staggering. But the dream of wealth and glory pushed them onward, blind to the disaster already beginning to unfold. From the moment they set foot on Jamestown's soil, death began its slow, relentless march. The land appeared lush, promising, but it turned cruel fast. The water was too salty to drink safely. Crops refused to grow in the marshy ground. And most of the men, gentlemen unaccustomed to labor, had neither the skill nor the will to farm, fish, or hunt effectively. Within weeks, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria swept through the camp. Food dwindled. The supplies brought across the Atlantic had never been meant to sustain them for a full year. Resupply ships didn't arrive on schedule, and local harvesting failed. Too many colonists refused to work, considering manual labor beneath their station. And the blazing summer heat of 1607 only made things worse. Insects swarmed everywhere. Drinking from the river poisoned them further. As desperation set in, they turned to grim measures: boiling leather scraps for broth, scavenging roots and acorns, hunting snakes and rats. Then came the winter. The settlers would later call it the starving time. Eyewitnesses wrote of horrors too grim to imagine. As starvation tightened its grip, the colonists resorted to unthinkable acts. They exhumed graves, boiling the flesh of the dead in desperate bids for survival. George Percy, one of Jamestown's leaders, later confessed in his journal that they were driven by insufferable hunger to devour those things which nature most abhorred. Of the roughly 500 settlers alive in the autumn of 1609, barely 60 survived to see the spring. If there was a turning point in Jamestown's early chaos, it came in the form of one man, Captain John Smith. A soldier, adventurer, and self-proclaimed survivor of many battles, Smith was no aristocrat. He carried no title, wore no powdered wig. But what he lacked in noble birth, he made up for in grit, audacity, and the kind of hard-won experience the floundering colony so desperately needed. By the autumn of 1608, with death stalking the camp and morale crumbling, Smith seized command. He didn't ask permission, he simply took charge. For the gentleman who had refused to soil their hands with labor, his decree was both blunt and absolute. He that will not work shall not eat. It wasn't a metaphor. Smith divided the colonists into work gangs, forcing them to build, farm, and gather firewood. No one was exempt. Hunger had no respect for social rank. But Smith understood that survival required more than discipline. He turned outward, forging uneasy relationships with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy that surrounded them. Where others viewed the native tribes with suspicion or hostility, Smith mixed diplomacy with shows of force. He traded copper pots and glass beads for corn and grain, balancing gifts with threats to secure desperately needed food. These exchanges were tense, often fragile, but they kept Jamestown from collapsing entirely. Smith's military background served him well. He mapped the Chesapeake Bay with remarkable precision, creating the first accurate charts of the region, maps that would guide future settlers. His explorations revealed a truth that many Englishmen failed to grasp. They were not alone. The land they claimed was not empty. It was alive with organized native societies, complex trade networks, and a political system that far outmatched their own tiny outpost. Yet for all his achievements, Smith made enemies. He was abrasive, proud, and quick to insult those who crossed him. In Jamestown, that included nearly everyone. In 1609, a gunpowder explosion left him badly burned. Whether it was a tragic accident or calculated sabotage remains a mystery, but the result was clear. Smith was sent back to England. Without his iron hand, Jamestown once again spiraled into chaos. But the foundations he laid, discipline, diplomacy, and a will to survive, left an indelible mark. Captain John Smith didn't create a utopia. He carved out a chance. And in the unforgiving wilderness of Virginia, that was more than most could hope for. But long before the English set foot on the Chesapeake shores, the land was far from empty. It was the heart of a vast Native American empire, the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Wahunsenkaw, known to the English as Chief Powhatan. This alliance of over 30 tribes controlled the entire region. They built villages, cultivated rich fields, maintained intricate trade networks, and governed through a complex political system. The English weren't pioneers. They were intruders. At first, Chief Powhatan saw opportunity in the strangers. The newcomers brought metal tools, beads, mirrors, and weapons, goods the Powhatan valued. Cautious relationship formed. There were exchanges of food and trinkets. Diplomacy, strained though it was, held together for a time. But tension brewed beneath the surface. In this fragile space between cultures, one figure emerged as a symbol of peace: Pocahontas. The daughter of Chief Powhatan, likely no more than 10 or 11 years old, Pocahontas was not a princess in the European sense, but she carried political weight in her father's world. According to John Smith, she famously intervened to save his life in 1607, a tale modern historians debate, wondering if it was exaggerated, misunderstood, or fabricated entirely. Whatever the truth, Pocahontas became a recurring figure in English accounts, often portrayed as a bridge between two worlds. She delivered messages, brought food, and seemed, for a brief moment, to embody the possibility of peace. But that peace was fragile. As Jamestown grew, so did English demands: more food, more land, more control. When trade faltered, the settlers raided Powhatan villages. Native warriors struck back. Trust dissolved quickly. The English viewed land as something to own. The Powhatans saw it as something to live within. These opposing worldviews made coexistence nearly impossible. By the winter of 1609, the fragile alliance shattered. The Powhatan Confederacy began a campaign of siege warfare, surrounding Jamestown and cutting it off from food and water during the brutal starving time. The colony, once again, teetered on the edge of oblivion. Any settler who dared step beyond the wooden walls of Jamestown risked ambush and death. Inside the fort, colonists wasted away from hunger and disease. It was more than a battle for land. It was a clash of worlds. For Chief Powhatan and his people, this was a defense of home and sovereignty. For the English, it was a divine mission, fueled by dreams of empire and God's favor. Neither side would bow easily. Few figures from early American history are as romanticized or misunderstood as Pocahontas. For centuries, her story has been polished into legend. A native princess saving a white Englishman, bridging two cultures with an act of pure love. But the truth is far more complicated and far more tragic. Her real name was Matoka. Pocahontas was a nickname, meaning playful one. She was likely no older than 11 or 12 when the English first arrived. Her early interactions with the colonists came largely through John Smith. Whether she truly saved his life, as Smith claimed later, remains uncertain. Historians debate if it was a rescue, a ritual, or a tale spun for English audiences. What is clear is that Pocahontas became a vital link between the Powhatan and the settlers. She carried messages, helped arrange food exchanges, and appeared at Jamestown not as some exotic curiosity, but as a political figure navigating a fragile peace. But as tensions deepened and diplomacy collapsed, Pocahontas vanished from English records for several years. Then in 1613, everything changed. During one of many skirmishes, she was captured by the English and held as leverage. Her captors demanded that Chief Powhatan return English prisoners and stolen weapons. When he hesitated, Pocahontas remained in captivity. During her imprisonment, she converted to Christianity, taking the name Rebecca. Some accounts suggest it was her choice. Others argue it was coerced. Either way, her conversion and assimilation made her an ideal symbol for colonial propaganda. In 1614, she married John Rolfe, a tobacco planter. Their union brought a temporary calm, later known as the Peace of Pocahontas. But this was no fairy tale. Pocahontas never returned to live among her people. 2 years later, she was taken to England, a living advertisement for the Jamestown experiment's supposed success. Dressed in fine gowns, speaking English, she was paraded before nobles and even presented to King James. Her image was reshaped to fit English ideals. Her true identity was overwritten by colonial ambition. In 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas fell ill and died suddenly. She was only around 21 years old. Her death silenced any illusion that harmony between the English and Powhatan could last. Pocahontas had lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. To the English, she became a symbol of conquest and assimilation. To her people, perhaps a tragic reminder of all that was being lost. By 1610, Jamestown had endured famine, disease, war, and leadership collapses, but barely. The Virginia Company back in London grew impatient. Investors wanted profit, not survival stories. There was no gold, no silk, no spices. Colonization was proving expensive, and Jamestown looked more like a financial disaster than a triumph. Then came tobacco. John Rolfe, the same man who married Pocahontas, brought with him seeds of Nicotiana tabacum from the Caribbean, a strain of tobacco smoother, milder, and far more addictive than the harsher native variety used by the Powhatan. English markets couldn't get enough of it. By 1612, Rolfe had successfully cultivated his first crop. Within a few years, tobacco transformed Jamestown from a starving outpost into a booming economic venture. The plant thrived in Virginia's warm, humid climate. Fields of tobacco stretched outward from the fort, turning once hostile land into agricultural gold. At last, the English had found their reason to stay. But tobacco came at a cost. The crop devoured soil nutrients, forcing the settlers to push further into native territory to maintain their yields. Escalating tensions with the Powhatan. The English demand for land clashed directly with indigenous survival. And then there was labor. Growing tobacco was grueling, backbreaking work. At first, the English relied on indentured servants, poor Europeans who sold years of their freedom in exchange for passage to the New World. But even tobacco wasn't enough. Within a few decades, Jamestown began importing enslaved Africans to meet the relentless demand for labor, a decision that would cast a long, dark shadow over American history. Tobacco had given the colony life. Exports soared. More settlers arrived. Land grants expanded. Jamestown was no longer an imperial experiment on the brink of collapse. It had become a functioning, profitable settlement. It wasn't the glittering future the Virginia Company had dreamed of. There were no gold mines, no silk, no cities rising from the wilderness. What they got instead was a muddy patch of earth and endless fields of tobacco. But it worked. For England, that was enough. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown. It bound the destiny of the American colonies to the soil, to labor, and to a deadly kind of success. In August 1619, a ship dropped anchor near Point Comfort, not far from Jamestown. Aboard were around 20 African men and women, captured by Portuguese traders, seized by English privateers, and now sold to the colonists. Their arrival seemed quiet at the time. There were no speeches, no sense of historic turning point. Official records described them simply as 20 and odd Negroes. Yet this moment would reverberate through centuries. The ship, the White Lion, had intercepted a Portuguese slave vessel en route to Spanish colonies. Once in Virginia, the Africans were exchanged for food and supplies. Their exact legal status remains debated. Were they enslaved in the full sense, or treated as indentured servants expected to earn freedom over time? Early records hint at a murky truth. Some, like Anthony and Isabella, would gain freedom and even own property. But as tobacco profits grew and labor demands intensified, the lines between indentured servitude and racial slavery began to harden. What began ambiguously soon evolved into a rigid system of race-based chattel slavery. At first, these Africans joined a colony already reliant on forced labor. Tobacco fields consumed more human effort than the dwindling population of indentured Europeans could provide. Disease and desertion thinned the workforce. African labor, viewed as durable and cost-effective, offered a cruel solution. Historians now recognize that August 1619 marked a foundational moment in American history, not just for Jamestown, but for the nation that would grow from it. That quiet arrival carried the seeds of a racial caste system that would shape laws, economies, and identities for generations. At the time, it was just another transaction in a settlement built on survival and profit. But its legacy was profound. Those first Africans, stripped of homeland, family, and freedom, laid down roots in Virginia soil. From their suffering and resilience would grow one of the longest, most painful chapters of American history. By 1619, Jamestown was no longer a ragged outpost clinging to life. It had become an economic engine, fueled by tobacco and powered by labor, both indentured and enslaved. Yet profit alone wasn't enough to bind its people together. When the Virginia Company's distant managers in London ignored colonial needs, settlers demanded a voice. What they created would shape the future of English America. In July 1619, Governor George Yardley convened the first General Assembly in Jamestown's simple church. 22 elected burgesses gathered from settlements along the James River, forming the first representative legislative body in English America. Over 3 days, they passed laws on land distribution, trade with native tribes, and even penalties for drunkenness. A bitter irony in a colony where wine and tobacco flowed freely. This assembly was far from perfect. Voting was limited to free male property owners, landholders, or those with significant tobacco yields. But it established a principle: political power derived from consent, not just royal decree. When settlers objected to unfair taxes or arbitrary arrests, they no longer pleaded with distant company directors. They turned to their elected burgesses. For the first time, Jamestown's residents had a mechanism to defend their interests, if they could keep it alive amid crisis. Trouble came swiftly. In 1622, English reinforcements failed to arrive. That same year, the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated assault, killing a quarter of the colony's population in a single morning. The General Assembly reconvened in haste, this time debating not prosperity, but survival, how to defend the settlements and care for the wounded. Jamestown had survived famine, disease, and chaos, but in the blood and smoke of 1622, its fragile place in the New World teetered once more on the edge. The Assembly quickly became more than just a legislative body, it was a lifeline. It authorized militias to protect against future attacks, regulated trade licenses to ensure fairness, and organized communal food stores for times of famine. Yet, even as Jamestown settlers learned to govern themselves, the Virginia Company's mismanagement persisted. Reports of embezzled funds, appalling mortality rates, and sporadic supply shipments reached London, and angered King James I. By 1624, the king had seen enough. He dissolved the Virginia Company's charter and declared Virginia a royal colony. From that point forward, Jamestown's governor would be appointed by the crown. But the General Assembly, the seed of self-government planted in 1619, remained intact. It survived charter collapse, deadly attacks, and economic turmoil. This fragile experiment in democracy had proven its worth. Through all the hardship, Jamestown was no longer just a private business venture. It had grown into a political community, forging institutions that would outlast its cradle of mud, mosquitoes, and brackish water. As tobacco fields spread and ships brought new waves of settlers, one idea became deeply woven into the fabric of English America. Ordinary colonists could elect representatives. That belief, born in a battered wooden church on the banks of the James River, would echo for centuries. By the mid-1620s, Jamestown had evolved. It was no longer the starving, desperate outpost of its early years. It had become both the symbolic and practical heart of English America. But its survival came at a brutal cost. Thousands of lives had been lost to starvation, disease, violent clashes, and backbreaking labor. This resilience, hard-won and uneven, set a pattern that would shape not only future colonies, but the United States itself and, ultimately, the modern world. Jamestown established precedents that were both profound and deeply troubling. Politically, it pioneered representative government in North America. The General Assembly gave settlers a direct voice in local laws and taxes. Though far from perfect, this system taught the colonists they could govern themselves. That lesson, planted in Jamestown's muddy streets, would bloom into the revolutionary spirit when tensions later rose between the colonies and the British Crown. Economically, tobacco's success changed everything. This brown gold tied American prosperity to agricultural exports, sparking the plantation system. That system's insatiable hunger for land and labor led first to indentured servitude, and soon after to the entrenched racial slavery that would define the American South for centuries. Culturally, Jamestown left its own enduring imprints. English language, laws, and religious traditions spread from this small settlement to the Atlantic coast and beyond. Yet alongside these legacies grew a culture of violence and racial division, evident in bloody conflicts with native peoples and the ruthless exploitation of enslaved Africans. The Powhatan people paid the heaviest price. Within decades, disease and war decimated their population, erasing an entire way of life. Jamestown's survival and success were built on tobacco and self-government, but they were also intertwined with this devastating loss, a contradiction at the heart of American history. Today, Jamestown is remembered not as a simple triumph, but as a layered story of survival, courage, greed, oppression, and innovation. Its legacy lives on in the democratic institutions born from its early experiments, in the cultural exchanges that reshaped the world, and in the deep wounds of systemic inequality that still mark the nation's soul. Jamestown's true inheritance is its complexity, a tale that resists easy heroes or villains. Instead, it reflects back a raw and honest image of what America would become: ambitious, contradictory, inventive, and often painfully human.